Good morning. On behalf of the King's College and its Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience, I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion, How Should We Think About Critical Race Theory? My name is David Tubbs. I teach courses in politics and constitutional law at King's, and I will be the moderator for this event. And we will have Q&A following the 4 panel presentations. In just a moment, I will introduce our panelists, but before doing so, I would like to share a few remarks about the decision at the King's College to organize this panel. With few, if any, harbingers of the change that was about to take place, critical race theory in 2021 has found its way into American political discourse at the local, state, and federal level. Some persons might suppose that critical race theory took shape during or after the summer of 2020, specifically following the death of George Floyd. In fact, critical race theory can trace its roots back to American legal scholarship in the 1980s and 1990s. But even if we can identify the intellectual origins of critical race theory, let us concede that there is much discussion and debate today about what critical race theory is. What does it mean today? This is not, however, entirely surprising because both normative and interpretative theories in the humanities and social sciences often evolve. Nonetheless, a public discussion or public debate about critical race theory, if it aims to be productive, must take account of the fact that people sometimes have different understandings of critical race theory. So it would seem in order to have a productive discussion, those participating in the discussion need to be talking about the same thing. This is one reason for today's panel, to provide clarity about what critical race theory is. A second reason for having this panel is to take up a large question. Specifically, how should we think about critical race theory? That is, how should we think about it as individual citizens, as Christians, and as a political community that seeks the common good? It is no secret that some Americans today are favorably disposed towards critical race theory and others are unfavorably disposed to it. Taking account of that fact, we thought it would be valuable to have panelists that correspond, at least roughly, to the spectrum of views in the United States today. And on that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order of their presentations, beginning with our first presenter, Dr. Nathan Luis Cartagena. Dr. Cartagena is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Wheaton College. He earned his PhD at Baylor University, and his teaching and scholarship at Wheaton focus on military ethics, race, critical race theory, and Thomas Aquinas. Our second presenter, Dr. Carol M. Swain, is now the Distinguished Senior Fellow for Constitutional Studies at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. She is also an author, speaker, and television commentator. She was previously a tenured professor and political scientist at Vanderbilt and Princeton universities. She is the author of several important books, including The New White Nationalism in America and Black Faces, Black Interest, published by Cambridge University Press and Harvard University Press, respectively. Her most recent book is called Black Eye for America: How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. Our third presenter this morning is Dr. Jacqueline C. Rivers. She is Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience at the King's College. She is also a lecturer at Harvard University and Executive Director of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She is teaching at King's this semester. She taught at King's in the spring semester as well. Dr. Rivers earned her bachelor's degree at Harvard Radcliffe College and her PhD at Harvard University. And our fourth presenter is Dr. George Yancey, Professor of Sociology at Baylor University. He has published scholarly articles on the topics of racial identity, academic bias, progressive Christians, and anti-Christian hostility. He is the author of several books, including There Is No God A Study of Atheism in the United States, and Compromising Scholarship, a book that explores religious and political biases in academia. Having completed my introductions, I would now like to turn things over to our first presenter, Dr. Nathan Luis Cartagena.
Hola, hermanos y hermanas. Greetings from the ancestral lands of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. I bring you greetings from mi familia in Illinois, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. And I bring you greetings from Wheaton College. I must thank Dr. David Tubbs for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. I must also thank Deborah Gonsalves for managing today's event. And many thanks to Dr. George Yancey, Dr. Jacqueline C. Rivers, and Dr. Carol M. Swain for dialoguing with me today. It's a joy to be with y'all. My fellow panelists and I have the unenviable task of offering satisfactory answers to the vexing question, how should we think about critical race theory? This question is vexing because many people within and without academia use CRT to refer to different things. Kimberly Crenshaw, a CRT founder and the inventor of the label critical race theory, spoke of this problem within academia in 2002. Quote, "The name critical race theory is now used as interchangeably for race scholarship as Kleenex is used for tissue," close quote. Sadly, things have not improved. As CRT scholar Tommy Curry argues, white liberal race scholars such as Shannon Sullivan have gentrified CRT, claiming the label while advancing work that fails to engage any of the movement's canonical texts. Outside academia, matters are worse. The indiscriminate use of CRT that Crenshaw criticizes is rampant. For example, although Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo are not CRT scholars and acknowledge as much, non-academic opponents of CRT regularly claim that Kendi and DiAngelo are CRT. On this false but widely held view, Kendi and DiAngelo are not just CRT scholars, they are CRT. Worse still, however, are political strategists like Christopher Rufo, who declare that they and their acolytes are using the moniker critical race theory to advance a culture war. Rufo writes, quote, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category," close quote. As CRT founder Patricia Williams argues, this definitional theft undergirds the prevalent tendency among CRT opponents to deem anything addressing racism as CRT. And so, the reasoning goes, evil, divisive, and racist. The varied meanings of CRT anticipate a second reason why the question, how should we think about how should we think about critical race theory, is vexing. The question's "we" is pregnant with unstated assumptions. To see what I mean, consider this question. To whom does the "we" refer? Does the "we" refer to all people, or is its scope narrower? Perhaps it strictly refers to U.S. Christians. Or maybe its scope is narrower still, referring specifically to U.S. Christians of the African diaspora. Even this restricted range raises challenges. It is one thing to examine what Black U.S. Catholics should think about CRT. It is another to evaluate what U.S. Afro-Caribbean brethren should think about it. Recognizing the vexing challenges inherent in the task of answering our guiding question, I proceed in two parts. First, I outline three senses of critical race theory. Here I speak to all people, offering a taxonomy that anyone desiring to understand CRT should have. Second, I conclude on a distinctively Christian note by arguing for a metaphor we should use when examining the relationship between lowercase c Catholic Christianity and CRT scholarship. So part one, what is critical race theory? Understanding critical race theory requires distinguishing three of its general senses: CRT proper, academic derivative senses of CRT, and culture war senses of CRT. Let's take these in turn. Like medieval scholastics, I use the word proper to refer to something's truest form. Hence, CRT proper refers to the original and ongoing form of CRT. Here's how I define it, and I'll slow down. Critical race theory is a legal movement aimed at understanding, resisting, and remediating how U.S. law and legal institutions, such as law schools, have fostered and perpetuated racism and white supremacy. Before unpacking this definition, I note that founding CRT scholars such as Robert A. Williams Jr. have endorsed it. Now let's unpack. First, CRT began in legal studies. Its creators are law professors, law students, and practicing lawyers. Second, CRT proper is a movement within legal studies. As a movement, it houses multiple and competing traditions, which themselves house multiple and competing theories. A contrastive example will illustrate this point. Derek Bell, CRT's founder, operated from and within the U.S. Black radical tradition. W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass fill his scholarship. Moreover, though Bell drew extensively on U.S. Black thought and practice, he rarely drew upon critical theorists and the Frankfurt School. Bell acknowledged these trends in correspondence with Tommy Curry. Curry, one of Bell's disciples, recognized that white liberals tried to understand Bell in terms of white thinkers like Michel Foucault, Karl Marx, and Jacques Derrida, and not members of the Black radical tradition. In response to Curry's claim that the white liberals were misunderstanding and misrepresenting Bell, CRT's founder replied, quote, "You have it exactly right. I consider myself the academic counterpart of Errol Garner, the late jazz pianist from my hometown, Pittsburgh, who never learned to read music fearing, as I understand it, that it would ruin his style. I think there must be value in Marxist and other writings, but I did not really read them in college and have had little time since. I do care about the thought and writings and actions of W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Frederick Douglass, et al. And you are right. At almost 77, I do not care to write in ways that whites can vindicate." Close quote. From his time in the NAACP working with Medgar Evers and Thurgood Marshall, to his becoming the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School, to the end of his career at NYU, Bell worked within the Black radical tradition to promote the Black freedom struggle. In contrast to Bell, Robert A. Williams Jr. of the Lumbee tribe operates from commitments to the Red Power movement. Indeed, Williams' mentor, Vine Deloria Jr., was an architect of this movement. Like Deloria, Williams respects and draws upon the Black radical tradition, but it is not the primary nor secondary tradition informing his work. Indigenous scholarship, post-colonialism, decolonialism, and critical theory are Williams' founts. Deloria, Edward Said, Albert Mimi, Homi Bhabha, and Walter Benjamin fill his works. Likewise, as a scholar, practicing lawyer, and activist committing to promoting Indigenous sovereignty and rights, Williams never operates within a Black-white binary. Indeed, he evaluates different ways in which racialized minority communities, Black and non-Black, experience racism and white supremacy. For example, Williams highlights that the same Supreme Court that denounced the racist anti-Black language of Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board drenched a decision the next year with racist anti-Indigenous language to justify withholding compensation from Native Alaskans for lands that Russia and the U.S. stole. This is T. Hitton versus the United States. Like Deloria, Williams attends to such racial differentiation to understand legalized white supremacy. Our contrast of Bell and Williams points to a third feature of CRT proper. Its adherents employ multidisciplinary methods and source material. CRT scholars believe that it is necessary to take up variegated perspectives and analytical tools to understand, resist, and remediate how U.S. law and legal institutions have produced and propagated racism and white supremacy. As CRT founders Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik write, quote, "The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group and self-interest, and emotions and the unconscious," close quote. Before considering another sense of CRT, let me emphasize that CRT proper is ideologically diverse. As Crenshaw writes, quote, "The notion of CRT as a fully unified school of thought remains a fantasy of our critics," close quote. From the outset, CRT scholars have disagreed about the relationships between patriarchy, homophobia, and racial power. Commenting on the movement's first official conference, Crenshaw recalls, quote, "Some of us felt that patriarchy and homophobia were intertwined in racial power and thus were inseparable from the scope of CRT. Others felt that racial subordination was distinct and should be theorized as such," close quote. More recently, CRT scholars have disagreed about the Black-white binary. Some, like CRT founder Mari Matsuda, argue that policymakers should focus on anti-Black racism. Others, follow Delgado in rejecting this view and arguing for the need to track all forms of racial subordination and oppression. Debates about these conceptualizations and practices persist. In addition to CRT proper, there are the academic derivative senses of CRT. This category refers to the forms of CRT that develop in academia as portions of the movement travel into other academic disciplines such as education and philosophy. I understand these senses of CRT in terms of Edward Said's work. In his essay, Traveling Theory, Said writes, quote, like people in schools of criticism, ideas and theories travel from person to person, from situation to situation, from one period to another. Cultural and intellectual life are usually nourished and often sustained by the circulation of ideas. And whether it takes the form of acknowledged or unconscious influence, creative borrowing, or wholesale appropriation, the movement of ideas and theories from one place to another is both a fact of life and a usually enabling condition of intellectual activity, close quote. The way disciplines and theorists use CRT proper varies. Gloria Lancet-Billings, for example, emphasizes the importance of applying CRT's insights and methods to education research in ways that are consistent with CRT proper. Daniel Solorzano, in contrast, acknowledges that he reinvents CRT in ways that are consistent with his commitments to pedagogical practices and scholarship inspired by Paulo Freire. Solorzano writes, quote, I believe it is our responsibility to reinvent CRT for the various fields and contexts in which it finds itself, close quote. In philosophy, scholars like Tommy Curry hew closely to and expand CRT proper. Curry's work in Black male studies is a case in point. Other philosophers, like Shannon Sullivan, not only reinvent CRT, they gentrify it. Whereas Solorzano quotes and engages canonical CRT texts, Sullivan does not. The third sense of CRT houses the culture war senses of CRT. These senses are so capacious and amorphous that they are nearly impossible to define. Recall again Christopher F. Rufo's declaration. Let me quote him in full. We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We'll eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans, close quote. Culture war agitators like Rufo aren't interested in offering a just, accurate understanding of CRT. Their public bragging reveals as much. And Christians should remember that whereas Proverbs 6 declares that God hates a lying tongue and a heart that devises wicked schemes, Rufo revels in both. Part 2, thinking metaphorically. If Christians should condemn Rufo-style culture war senses of CRT, how should they think about CRT proper or academic derivative senses of it? Let me propose two truths that should guide lowercase c Catholic examination of either sense. First, like Clement of Alexandria, we should affirm that God is the ultimate source of truth. For us, all truth, even extra-biblical truth, is God's truth. Here, extra-biblical refers to truths not contained in Scripture. Scripture tells us nothing about when the U.S. colonized Puerto Rico to expand Anglo-Saxon white supremacy, or that Puerto Rico is the world's oldest colony. But it is true that the U.S. colonized Mi Gente for racist reasons in 1898. And it is true that we are the world's oldest colony. These are historic truths of creation, and so they belong to God, creation source and sustainer. Second, we should affirm that everyone thinks through metaphors. Teachers think through the metaphors of gardening, building, and traveling, for example, when designing a course or lesson plan. And the Apostle Paul has us think about the church through the metaphors of human bodies and masonry work. We think through metaphors, and Scripture encourages it. Here, we face a question. What metaphors should we use when considering the extra-biblical truths in CRT scholarship? While we should follow Paul and good teachers by not limiting ourselves to one, I contend that we should think about CRT scholarship through Boethius's metaphor of turning philosophical water into theological wine. When Derek Bell demonstrates the international trashing of the U.S. for being a racial apartheid state rather than a moral revolution played a major role in Brown v. Board, it's philosophical water. When Charles Lawrence III argues that everyone in the U.S. is racist because we all are socialized into racist imaginaries, it's philosophical water. When Ian Heney Lopez proves that Congress included the white person prerequisite in every naturalization act from 1790 until 1952, it's philosophical water. When Robert A. Williams evaluates the Supreme Court's claim that, quote, power, war, and conquest determine rights, close quote. That's Worcester versus Virginia, 1832, still US law. It's philosophical water. When Richard Delgado details how Latinx residents in the US carry the, quote, badges and incidents of conquest, not US slavery, close quote, it's philosophical water. When Kimberly Crenshaw reveals the court's failures to redress intersecting racial and gender subordination, it's philosophical water. When Mari Matsuda establishes the need for Japanese reparations, it's philosophical water. When Laura E. Gomez exposes the Latinx community's historic willingness to trade in anti-Black and anti-Asian racism while advocating the other white policy, it's philosophical water. And when Cheryl Harris shows that the U.S.'s legal commitments to whiteness the U.S.'s legal commitments to whiteness as property, it's philosophical water. Christian discipleship involves drinking these philosophical waters. It involves repeated returns to them, and it involves bringing them into contact with Trinitarian theology to make theological wine. May we Christians, like our Lord, Savior, and Liberator, Jesus of Nazareth, be known for making the best wine. Thank you. I now pass it on to Dr. Carol M. Swain.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me this morning. And I will approach this subject from the practical aspects of how it manifests itself in our society. Critical race theory is something that started in law schools, and it is one of a number of different critical theories. There's critical gender theory, there's critical queer theory, critical colonialism theory, critical feminist theory. And so critical race theory is one of several different critical theories. And what they share in common is that they divide people. And in America, the critical theory that I address in my book, Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House, is a critical theory that divides the world in America into two groups: white oppressors and minority victims, the oppressed. And it differs from economic Marxism, because I argue it has clear Marxist roots. It differs from economic Marxism because it's focused on race, but power. And according to this theory, white people, anyone that's born with white skin, they have racism in their DNA. They are responsible for systemic racism. We are told by critical race theorists that whiteness is a property, and that white people have to divest themselves of their whiteness, and that only white people have an obligation to be anti-racist. And critical race theory, as I understand it, operates very much like a religion, because white people are expected to confess that they are all racist, regardless of whether their ancestors were abolitionists or people who risked their lives setting up the Underground Railroad. And all minorities are victims. And the damages that I see to the minority community, especially Blacks, is that the argument that racism is permanent means that, it's there, it's going to be there forever. And no matter how many white people are actively anti-racist, racism is still going to be there. And the CRT that has seeped down into the K through 12 educational arena, part of what it does that's very destructive, I think, for white and Black children. For Black children, it involves arguments such as ethno-mathematics, where the case is made that math is racist and that different cultures can get different answers to mathematical equations and problems. And so some teachers have been encouraged not to press minority students for homework or for right answers. We also told by some of the people associated with critical race theory that getting to places on time, being punctual, working hard, sitting quietly in a classroom, planning for the future, hard work, that that is whiteness. And the messages that are being sent to young people are messages that I believe are quite destructive. And for white children, some of the reports that we're getting all across the country, as young as kindergarten and first grade, white children are coming home, in some cases crying, very much embarrassed by what they're told that their ancestors did. And in cases where students have pushed back, there's been bullying and shaming of children. And there's a rich body of research about the harm done that comes from bullying and shaming of children. And so I approach the critical race theory argument as I see critical race theory as the #1 civil rights issue of our day. And in my book, Black Eye for America, we talk about what critical race theory is, where it comes from. And so it's not just the Marxist roots, it's also related to postmodernism and some other theories that come from the philosophical realm, and the legal studies. All of these things are part of critical theory, but how it impacts our society, how it manifests itself. We argue that it is un-American, that in America, we don't bully people and shame them because of the color of their skin. We don't do that to children. And when it's done, we should all stand up and condemn it. We also argue that it is unconstitutional, that it runs contrary to the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and also in some cases, the First Amendment, because it requires compelling people to do things to be accepted. And so in many places where they may have sensitivity training or CRT training, it could be in the workplace, it could be in the classroom, but people are being compelled to attend and sometimes affirm statements that they're very uncomfortable with. And most importantly, it runs counter to our civil rights laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its extensions in 1972, as well as civil rights laws that have been passed in various states and localities. And in my book, Black Eye for America, we talk about these things. We have chapters on it, and we also have 2 chapters on how to fight back against critical race theory. And I'm gonna give you some of the strategies very quickly, because we don't have a ton of time. Fighting back. Some of the things that we think are very important that is for people to know what critical race theory is, where it comes from, and how it impacts our society, and how we can combat its influence. I see its influence as being very evil and destructive to our children. I don't care about, what happens on college campuses as long as it's not forced on people. But when it's children who have not been taught critical thinking skills, they don't have an awareness of history or even themselves, I think it's very dangerous. I encourage people to challenge the legality and constitutionality of CRT in education and in the workplace. Everyone has a right to be in a hostile-free working environment as well as learning environment. Organize grassroots movements to elect school boards, city council members, mayors who will focus on eliminating CRT and its indoctrination efforts, such as the 1619 Project within their respective domains. Build broad coalitions that reach across racial, ethnic, and partisan divides. This is not a Republican versus Democrat issue or liberal versus conservative issue. This is something that affects our entire society. Use multiple strategies, including town hall meetings, writing op-eds, contacting public officials, organizing rallies to talk about these issues. Educate church leaders and encourage them to lead on racial issues using biblical justice and biblical foundations rather than social justice. Stand up to big tech and corporations, monitor state and local agencies to ensure that taxpayers' money is not being used to subsidize organizations that advance hostility, excuse me, hostility to our nation or to our civil rights laws and our Constitution, and then develop alternatives to DEI. And one of the things that I have done is incorporate a company called Unity Training Solutions that offers an alternative. And some of the things that parents are doing that I think is very important is that you can always exit. If your child is in a school where they're being taught things that make them feel very uncomfortable, that runs counter to your values, you can always, move to homeschooling. As many parents have done, whites, blacks, Hispanics, they're moving to homeschooling. They're moving to private schools that are not teaching CRT, and they're moving to charter schools. And so this is a moment that's very important. And because there's, so many technical terms and specialized terms that come from academia, and in many ways, I see academia as being the root of a lot of evil. This book has a glossary that was current 2 months ago when the book was published, but every day the words change meaning. But a glossary, index, citations, and resources as far as organizations that you can contact who are also trying to fight CRT. So my background is in academia. I'm no longer in academia. I'm out there battling with the American people over something that I believe is very important. And again, I see CRT as it has morphed and infiltrated our K-12 schools and just about every sector of our society, including the US military. I see it as very destructive. And so I'm dedicating my life to informing people about it, and also the influence it's having on our churches. Our churches ought to be leading on the race issue. They should not be following, and they certainly shouldn't be taking guidance from a theory that has Marxist roots. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I would like to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Rivers.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Tubbs, for hosting us. Thank you to all of my co-panelists and to the King's College for allowing us to discuss this really important topic. And I am just delighted to see so many students present. I think that this is, you are the future. And so I want to thank Dr. Cartagena for his very comprehensive review of how critical race theory arose. But in this presentation, I'd like to focus on some of the basic tenets in a book by Delgado and Stefanik, who are two of the key scholars in the movement. And they go back and they recognize, as Dr. Cartagena said so clearly, that there is a great deal of diversity within the movement. But there are 5 key tenets that they outline in their book, Introduction to Critical Race Theory. 1, racism is normal. 2, there's an interest convergence theory. 3, that race is a socially constructed reality. 4, there's a phenomenon known as differential racialization. And 5, that people of color have a unique voice. I want to focus on 2 of those tenets and then offer a brief critique of some of the ideas related to critical race theory. So I want to focus on the first, racism is normal. I think that is really a sweeping statement if you interpret it as every single person is racist. I also think it is not the same as saying that every white person is born with racism in their DNA. That is not true, especially given the understanding of what race is that I'm going to talk about shortly. I want to point out how race continues to have an important impact today, even in our so-called post-racial society. Race affects employment chances, especially for people at the low end of the socioeconomic ladder, for those who are working class, especially. Deborah Pager, a leading sociologist, in 2003 did a study on callback rates for men with a prison record, and she did this in Milwaukee. She had pairs of Black and white testers go and actually apply for jobs in person. And each team member was given very equivalent resumes, and the resumes were, they would actually randomly be assigned to a resume, and it would be switched back and forth so that they were presenting the same resumes. And one resume reported that the applicant had a criminal record. The other resume did not report any criminal record. What she found was this: white men, and she did this just with men, who didn't have a criminal record were called back for a job interview 34% of the time. White men without a criminal record were called back 17% of the time. Blacks with a criminal record were called back 5% of the time. And perhaps most shocking, Black men without a criminal record were called back 14% of the time, less than the white men who did have a criminal record. Race is real, and not necessarily practiced by people who are intentionally racist. It influences people in subtle ways. They may not even be conscious. And this doesn't just apply to white people. It applies to Hispanics, it applies to Asians, it even applies to Black people, that we respond in racist ways at times. And in talking about racism here, I'm talking about a structural system. I will talk more about that later. I'm not just talking about individual prejudice or individual preconceptions. I'm really talking about a system that exists. Let me give you another example. There was a study on callback rates for job applicants with Black sounding names that was also done in the 21st century. And I've tried to stick in this section to examples from the 21st century. So we're not talking about 1950s. We're not talking about the days of slavery. I'm talking about what's happening relatively currently. This study was done in Boston and Chicago. Resumes were created. There were two types of resumes. Resumes that were seen as high quality resumes, very strong resumes, and those that were weaker. And they randomly, names that had been tested for whether they would be associated with a Black person, like Jamal, or with a white person, like Becky, names were selected and assigned to the resumes. And then these resumes were mailed in. So these employers were not even meeting the people. They were simply being exposed to a name that might be associated with a Black person or a white person. And they found that white resumes attached to white sounding names. Remember, these are the same resumes. It's just sometimes an employer would get that resume with a Black sounding name. Sometimes they'd get the resume with a white sounding name, that employers called back resumes that had a white sounding name attached 50% more frequently than they called back resumes attached to a Black sounding name. That means that the Black applicants would have to apply to 30 jobs in order to get as many interviews as a white applicant would get from simply 20 applications. They'd have to do 10 more applications just to match. And they found that this was true across a number of industries and occupations and employer sizes. And they were looking at sales, admin support jobs, clerical jobs, customer service jobs, so white collar jobs. Okay, the other thing that I want to point out is race affects where people want to live. So Camille Charles did a study of residential preferences in the 21st century in Los Angeles. And she found that 20% of whites in the 21st century in Los Angeles, an extremely diverse city, preferred neighborhoods which had no Black households. She found that white respondents' average preferred neighborhood though diverse, had a majority of white occupants, neighbors. 53% of the neighborhood would be white. So even in the 21st century, race is having a role in where people choose to live. And that has really important implications for education, which I will return to a little later. Finally, I want to point out that the Pew Research Center did a study in 2019 on how important race is in getting ahead. 56% of whites think that being white helps with getting ahead. 56% of white people think that being white helps them get ahead. 80% of white Democrats, or those who lead Democratic, think that the legacy of slavery affects Blacks a great deal or a fair amount. And even among white Republicans and those who lean Republican, 40% think that the legacy of slavery is still affecting Black people's ability to do well in American society. So race continues to have a substantial impact. And that's one of the key ideas in critical race theory. I also want to focus on this idea of the social construction of race. First, you can tell looking at me that I'm Black, and you can tell that Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they're white. Or can you? Is the concept of race even biologically based? There is no biological basis for race. There are no clear biological markers for different races. And as Ian Haney Lopez puts it, there are no genetic characteristics possessed by all Blacks, but not by non-Blacks. Similarly, there is no gene or cluster of genes common to all whites, but not to non-whites. So even though there's that physical appearance, there's in fact no biological basis at the genetic level for races. And in addition to that, if you're simply looking at someone, Walter White is a famous example, leader of the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement, and he could have passed for white. If you were to see his photograph right now, it would not occur to you that this was a Black man. And all of this lack of a physical identifying marker or a genetic marker for race was not because for lack of trying. There was an extensive but futile search for markers at the physical level in the 19th century. In 1972, biologist Richard Lewontin found that there was more genetic variation between racial groups than within them. 85% of the variation occurred within racial groups. So among whites, there was high levels of variation. Among Blacks, high levels of variation, less variation between them. Marcus Feldman of Stanford University reports that more sophisticated analyses conducted recently have confirmed Lewontin's initial findings. In fact, it's 89 to 94% of genetic variation that happens within groups of people who originate from the same continent, so from Europe or from Africa. And in fact, variation is related more to how far apart long-established populations live than with their racial identification. There's more genetic variation between Spaniards and Swedes than there is between Spaniards, who are supposedly white, North Africans who are supposedly Black, because of their geographic proximity to each other. So the other thing I want to say about this idea of social construction of race is that race has been defined by arbitrary definitions that vary across time and across geography. So there's a census categorization in the US, an interesting process. Since early in the 18th century, the one-drop rule was established. Anyone who had any Black ancestry, any African ancestry was treated as Black. But by the 1950s, census takers in the US were actually ascribing the race of the people whom they were recording in the census by appearance. So anyone like Walter White being recorded in the census would be assumed to be white when in fact he did have African-American heritage and he was Black. By the 1960s, the census was now allowing people to self-report their race. However, many of them came from countries where they would not be defined as Black, even though according to the one drop rule, they would. And people could just decide what race that they wanted to embrace. In 1997, the Census Bureau made things even more confusing by allowing multiracial categories. So someone could say that they were biracial, Black and Chinese, or that they were Asian and white. So somebody who was Black in the 1950s could have been recorded as white in the 1960s when they were self-reporting, or multiracial in the 1990s when they claimed Black and white heritage. Similarly, if you look at countries like in the Caribbean or in Brazil, race is not simply seen in binary terms, Black and white, but rather in Jamaica, I would be considered brown rather than Black. So this idea of race is socially constructed. Something really important as one aspect of the social construction of race is the structural nature of racism. And I want to talk now about the role of government policy in the economic disadvantage that Black people experience. According to the analysis of the eminent political scientist, Ira Katz-Nelson, government policy implemented during the New Deal, in particular in the GI Bill, was the most important contributing factor to the enduring wealth gap between Blacks and whites. Currently, the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average Black family. And in fact, working class white families often have more wealth than upper middle class. Working class white families have more wealth than upper middle class Black families. And here, when I'm talking about wealth, I'm not talking about income, but I'm talking about home ownership, owning stocks and bonds, jewelry, other assets of that nature. This came about during the New Deal because Southern Democrats, who were opposed to having Blacks benefit from the New Deal, had them excluded from Social Security and unemployment benefits. They blocked the participation of domestic workers and farm laborers, the two industries in which Blacks were most heavily employed. And they insisted that programs be administered locally so that state officials had the opportunity, the discretion to limit or the benefits Blacks were allowed to access or to exclude them altogether. And this had especially deleterious effects in the GI Bill, which permitted veterans to access loans to purchase homes, access to job training, access to scholarships for college. And in fact, the GI Bill was the most important engine that created the white middle class, giving white veterans and their families a leg up in the acquisition of homes and careers. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't a matter of no advantage being accorded to anyone. Veterans were given a big advantage in establishing their homes and in buying homes and establishing their careers. But African Americans were systematically excluded because of the administration at the local level by those same Southern Democrats that I mentioned earlier. Black veterans were denied loans, refused mortgages, excluded from colleges, especially in the South, which was where most Blacks lived. And the result of this systemic exclusion of African Americans was that they were vastly disadvantaged economically. Now that happened in the middle of the 20th century, not during the times of slavery, but you'll say to me, we're in the 21st century now. However, it's a handicap that has grown over the decades because the homes owned by whites have really increased in value. While Black homes, first of all, Blacks had much lower rates of home ownership. And secondly, in Black neighborhoods, there was little opportunity for those homes to increase in value. One important factor here was redlining, which was implemented by the Federal Housing Authority. It was indispensable. The Federal Housing Authority was indispensable in terms of supporting whites in getting mortgages, in accessing capital to build wealth. However, the Federal Housing Authority classified Black neighborhoods as uninsurable. So Blacks couldn't get mortgages, couldn't build equity in homes. And by 1984, white households' net worth was over $39,000. And Black households' net worth was just over $3,000, just 9% of what it was for whites. And the primary source of the difference was the lack of home ownership among Blacks. And as I said earlier, this is a difficult thing to catch up on because it's like compound interest. The value of houses keep rising. And if you're left out of the race and you start later, people are so far ahead, impossible to catch up. Currently, it continues to have an impact through exclusionary zoning. These are housing restrictions in suburbs which prohibit multifamily housing in these rich suburbs and require that all single-family homes be built on large lots. It severely limits the access of poor people to homes in suburbs and has a disproportionate impact on Black people because we are disproportionately poor. It has a knock-on effect in terms of limiting access to high-quality public education. Public education systems in these suburbs are extremely effective, and in inner city neighborhoods where most Blacks live, they are just the opposite, really inadequate and underperforming. I want to say that this is not, this doesn't mean that there are no Blacks who actually benefited from the New Deal, nor is it true that there are no Blacks who benefit from public education or from access to independent schools. We all know that America has already elected its first Black president. So clearly there has been change. And that leads me to my critique of critical race theory. Derek Bell often talked about racial realism and articulated this idea of the permanence of racism. Well, I have to say racism has proven itself to be durable and to be to morph as various forms of racism are attacked, but it is clearly not true that nothing has changed. And in fact, Delgado and Stefanik in their third edition of the Introduction to Critical Race Theory take a gentler approach at the end as they look towards the future. They actually say, you know, there have been changes and it's possible that America will continue to change. So that's one important critique. We've had slow racial progress, uneven racial progress, sometimes going backwards. It's not guaranteed. Racial progress is not guaranteed. We have to struggle for it. We have to fight for it, but it has been happening. I also want to say that Stefanik and Delgado, they talk about equality of results. That doesn't seem quite reasonable. We need to have equality of opportunity. But how will we know when we really have equality of opportunity? If I can't predict the outcome of a person's life simply by knowing their race, we don't have equality of opportunity. We have massive economic inequality. As I said, white families have 10 times the wealth on average of Black families. We have mass incarceration, which is much in which Blacks are heavily represented. Black men are about 8 times as likely to go to prison. We have lack of access to high quality education because Black people are trapped in underperforming public school systems in inner cities. That's not equality of opportunity. And I want to just point out, I want to move to the Christian perspective, so I'm going to skip something here. As Christians, we have a responsibility to distinguish between what the scholars of CRT claim and what their critics say is in fact critical race theory. We need to focus on really discerning what is in fact critical race theory and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I also want to remind us that, in fact, we as Christians have a responsibility to weigh these ideas, to recognize where they are speaking truth, where they are accurate, and to reject the errors. In Divided by Faith, Michael Emerson and Chris Smith write about the fact that Americans undervalue the importance of structure, that Americans tend to assume that what happens in your life is due to how hard you work, how smart you are. They don't give any credit for the fact that your parents were able to pay for your college education in full, while a white student's college education in full, while a Black student is heavily in debt coming out of college. They don't pay attention to the idea that there are laws, such as I described in the New Deal, which advantaged one group and disadvantaged another group. They don't think about the fact that social structure means that Black students are trapped going to poor inner city public schools, and white students, much more of them, have access to high performing suburban public schools. We need to recognize the power of structure and respond to that. We're responsible to know the truth because all truth is God's truth. And so we must know it, teach it, and respond to it. We need to act to defend the disadvantaged, as Jesus tells us in Matthew 25:14. He says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And in Proverbs 31:8 and 9, it says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And now I'd like to pass it off to Dr. George Yancey.
Thank you all. And I too want to thank my co-presenters for this opportunity to discuss this important issue. And to be honest, this was not an issue that was really on my radar about a year ago, but it obviously has, am I on mute? Okay. But it really has become a key issue in our society today. I have a slide PowerPoint I want to share, and so I'll get it started. There we go. All right, so as I said, this wasn't a big issue in my mind, because even though I read of it in grad school and really when it came to teaching, I didn't really teach much about it until my upper division graduate level course. So it wasn't a great issue, but of course it's become all the controversy. What I would like to bring to this discussion is, as a social scientist, what does that controversy mean, and what's the implications of it? And then briefly touch on what I think would be a Christian approach towards handling that sort of controversy. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. In order to prepare to talk about these issues, I did some reading on some of the arguments against critical race theory in schools, some of the protests, just to see what people were saying about it. And here's what I found. Some of the arguments that people were saying about critical race theory. First, that is anti-white. So I heard that a lot when I'm listening to people complain about it and being put in schools. It does not tolerate disagreements. That was another thing that came up. It divides us into oppressors and the oppressed, so that either you're an oppressor or you are the oppressed, and therefore you can't get away from that, and how that poisons kids' minds. It distorts history with too much focus on racial issues, was another complaint that I saw brought to the forefront. It creates animosity instead of unity. It divides instead of bringing us together. So as I hear people saying this, and keeping in mind what was already produced as critical race theory proper, what are the implications of this? Well, one of the things I think as we look at these complaints is that those who are attacking critical race theory are coming at it from a perspective of what I would call colorblindness. They are addressing the idea that the best way to deal with our racial divide is to basically ignore race. And critical race theory, of course, brings race to the forefront. Whatever you want to say about critical race theory, there is a focus on how racialized our society is. One of the dynamics of critical race theory is that racism is normal in the United States, and it's just a normal part. And so naturally, a theory that has that as one of its tenets, it's going to face the ire of people who say the way we deal with racism is we ignore racism, we move on in our lives. I think there's more to that, and I want to look at that as well as elements of the CRT controversy, as I would call it. So, CRT controversy. I would agree with many people who say that many of those complaints are not well-founded, that they are based on what I would call a critical race theory mythology of what people think critical race theory is, and a tendency to place the things that you don't like about diversity efforts into critical race theory and then complain that it is critical race theory. And whether I've not looked into the origins of this, whether it's done by Rufo or others, that's clear to me, what it says to me. So what are some elements of critical race theory controversy? First, let me just establish that critical race theory can be criticized. And we've already heard that critical race theorists themselves criticize each other. So the notion that critical race theory can be criticized, look, I don't claim to be a critical race theory expert, but for me, the idea of interest conversions, I don't buy into that. I've done too much causal modeling to think that the reason why things happen is basically because it serves whites. I think there's a lot more to it. I think there's a lot more nuance to that. I criticize critical race theory to the degree that it pushes this sort of idea of interest convergence. So the idea that we're not allowed to criticize it is not fair, because even within critical race theorists, that they themselves are criticizing each other. And yes, even those people like me who don't claim to be an expert in critical race theory, I have a right to read and criticize critical race theory. But, and here's, I think, a key element. Most critics don't understand the theory well enough to criticize it. And I will admit that I don't understand all the nuances and all the debates in it. I've read enough to be able to criticize certain elements of it. I think we are obligated to understand something before we criticize it. And to the degree that we're not willing to undergo the understanding of it, to read people who support it and advocate for it and then critique it, I think we need to be careful as we engage in it. And one of the things that disturbs me from some of the attempts to criticize critical race theory, just as a little side note, I happened to be in Nashville a couple of months ago, the Southern Baptist Convention, where one of the big issues was the pushing of critical race theory into the seminaries. And as people came up there and said, they're doing critical race theory and explain what they're doing, I was turning to my pastor and saying, Pastor, that's not critical race theory. So it sort of takes away what you're really, your argument when you're criticizing something that's not true. I think often what the critics are reacting to are the derivatives of critical race theory, but not critical race theory itself. For example, I would argue that a derivative of critical race theory is what I would call anti-racism. Anti-racism is something I've been reading about as I've been doing some work in this area. Kendi himself has said that he's influenced by critical race theory, even though he's not doing critical race theory. So I would look at that as a derivative of critical race theory, not critical race theory proper, but a logical consequence of critical race theory if you want to take it that way, although you can get to anti-racism in other directions as well. I think critics would be well-founded to say, we don't want to see, say, white fragility taught in our schools and critique that, rather than saying, we don't want critical race theory taught in our schools because that's not what white fragility is. It's a derivative, but it's not critical race theory proper. And this reaction to derivatives, I think it's mixed up into saying this is critical race theory when it really is a derivative of it. We can see there's some overlap, but it's not critical race theory proper. And that then just complicates things because now we have less accurate understanding of what's happening because these people are criticizing something that is not true, is not what they say they're criticizing. The reaction to critical race theory reflects the larger racial conflict in our society. The reason why I wanted to point out what the critics were saying was this is about a notion of colorblindness. A certain percentage of our society feels that the best way to deal with racism is to ignore race. That is in conflict with others who advocate a more proactive approach towards dealing with racism, a more aggressive approach to dealing with racism. The argument today is not the argument of 100 years ago. The argument of 100 years ago was, are people of color human, fully human? 99.9% of the people, that's not even a question. The question is, what do we do about centuries of racial abuse and how do we overcome that? There are those who argue the way we overcome that, the way you beat racism is you beat racism. You don't acknowledge race. You may agree or disagree with that. I'm just saying that that is the argument that's out there. Others argue that the way you deal with racism is a more aggressive, proactive approach, understanding race in its multiple levels. Critical race theory falls into that second group. It's not the only way of falling into that second group, but it does fall into that second group. The reaction to it then reflects this conflict on what do you do about racism in our society. And the reaction and the fighting that you're seeing is this fighting that if it wasn't critical race theory, it would be something else, because that's the fight that we're having in our society today. Now, I'm going to propose something, and I'll admit that I don't have like solid sociological data, which I tend to like to have before I make proclamations, but I'll go ahead and do it anyways and take whatever blowback that's going to come, because I do think that there's something to this. I think some of the backlash reflects the desire of some whites to have a place in the discussion on racial issues. And here's what I'm saying about this. Last year, we had George Floyd and Arbery, and we had the protests and everything like that, and we had activism. All that was taking place. And I think for some, and I'm not saying that all the critical race theory fall into this category. That's, once again, I'm into nuance. But I think some of the people who are now criticizing critical race theory were sitting back and watching that. And some of the whites were thinking things such as, they get to protest and their grievances, and I don't have grievances that I can protest. Along comes the controversy of critical race theory. And along comes some of the criticisms I just showed you. And now for some of these individuals, they now feel they have a place to say in the racial issues, because now they can claim that they have been offended, and they can claim that they have been mistreated. And I'm not going to say that there isn't any justification to some of the complaints that are made, because there are some of the trainings and some of the elements that, while it's not critical race theory proper, there are some things that I think are justifiable complaints. But I think the key to this is that all of a sudden now, they can engage in this discussion like everyone's protest and like everyone else engage on how they face racism and things of this nature. I think that is part of the backlash that we're seeing, is that people who last year this time couldn't go and say how they were offended or how they face racism, now they have this opportunity to do that. And I think that has created more of this sort of volatile mixture that we have in our society. Once again, I wish I had strong evidence to really substantiate that, but it's just my sense on how people are approaching things that is part of what's happening. Now, I want to say that I think there's a better way than the conflict that I talked about. And I don't have the time to really go all into this. I only have about 15 minutes, and I do presentations 2 hours and more along these ways. So you'll have to bear with me and feel free to ask questions about this. I think there's a better way than this colorblindness versus proactive approach. And I actually think that it is a more theologically based way, and I'd be happy to go into that in the question and answer session if someone wants to. But let me just say that the derivatives of critical race theory, such as anti-racism, has attempted to silence whites in the racial conversation. How can we deny that when something like white fragility is all the rage, which basically says to whites, the only thing you need to do is do what people of color say to do. I don't think that's healthy. For a variety of reasons, I think that's not healthy. And there's research showing that this is not a healthy approach. And Once again, I can go into that if necessary. What I think we need is better conversations to move away from polarization to community building. And I think that's the key. And I think to the degree that we don't have these better conversations, to the degree that we stay in our silos and lob bombs at each other, I think that we're going to be stuck where we're at. And I agree that we have made progress on racial issues. There's no doubt about that. And I'm old enough, even though hopefully I don't look that old, but I am old enough to know the progress we've made. One of the things that I tell people is one of the things that got me really spurred into dealing with racial issues was, as a young man, I fell in love with a white woman and her family would not meet with me because I was Black. Today, that would be almost unthinkable in our society. So just that shows that there's been some progress. There has been progress. Not enough. But to say there's been no progress is just that's not accurate. But to go any further, I think we have to have better conversations. And if we keep doing what we've been doing, I think that's being insane. With insanity being doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. What we need to do is to move away from this polarization. And to do that, I think we need to start thinking about collaborative conversations as a possible alternative. Now, what that would mean, just in this last couple of minutes, coming to conversations where we hear each other out, where we learn how to communicate with other individuals and how to listen to them, and try to find, are there solutions that we can move together on? And we all mutually have the responsibility of entering these conversations. The solutions are not necessarily going to look mutual because we had these centuries of racial abuse that we have to overcome. I don't think solutions are going to look like, hey, we're just going to all have these exact same responsibilities. You put it on the table, but I don't think that's going to be the solutions. The solutions, though, are going to be something that we arrive at together, rather than, hey, this is what I figure out is true. And I got to convince everyone to do the thing that I think is true. Now, I got to listen to you, and you got to listen to me, and we got to come at it together. I think that's the alternative that we have to think about. And to the degree that critical race theory, my personal session of my personal evaluation of critical race theory is basically this. I don't know who I'm representing in this conversation. We're supposed to represent a range. I don't know who I'm representing. But my thing is, I think critical race theory does a very good job in identifying problems in our society. The notion of looking at how race is not just individualized, the notion of institutional problems, how it has formed our laws and can continue to form our laws. I'm not that convinced that it offers the best solutions. And I think that cloud conversations is a much better approach for us to go to. So that's what I want to bring into this conversation. And since I'm in this conversation, I will be shameless and offer my plug for my book coming out in March on Beyond Racial Division. You'll already have your books out, so mine is coming. So if people spend money on your books, they're spending money on mine. So I'll just be shameless in that plug. And with that, I will end my presentation, and I can stop the screen share. There we go. Okay, and now I will turn it back over to Dr. David Tubbs for questions and answers.
Thank you to all the panelists for such stimulating presentations. And as we expected, a lot of questions have come in, and there are questions that are directed to each individual panelist. So I'd like to give each panelist a question proceeding in the same order in which they presented. So I start with Dr. Cartagena. One member of the audience asks, you are clearly a sympathizer, friend, proponent of critical race theory, but what, in your judgment, is the biggest flaw in critical race theory?
What is the biggest flaw in critical race theory? Well, one of the things I want to emphasize is that there is tremendous ideological diversity. So, for example, I find in Derek Bell, there are times where there's a kind of biological racial essentialism at work. I think that's highly problematic. There are times when I'm reading Derek Bell where the ways in which he's operating in the black-white binary, I think this is leading you not to see the range of ways in which U.S. law is going to promote forms of white supremacy. And so here I'd follow somebody like Richard Delgado. I say this because there's so much ideological diversity that it is very difficult to say, here's the one thing that all CRT scholars endorse that I think is highly problematic. And this has come out even in our discussions. And so, for example, to give you perhaps one that has a little bit more of a punch to it for certain Christian audiences, there are times where Charles Lawrence III and Mari Matsuda will say, if somebody doesn't hold the exact same views that we do about gender and sexuality, they can't be critical race theorists. But Delgado, Crenshaw, and Lopez, they don't endorse that. So that's a really radical difference. It leads to different kinds of willingness for conversations, et cetera. I think one final thing that I'll add to this is the permanence thesis came up multiple times, and I do want to address this because if Derek Bell said racism is permanent in the sense that there's been no progress, we would have to reject that claim. But Derek Bell actually goes to great lengths in multiple pieces to say that he believes racism is permanent, but that it morphs. And so he doesn't think that the racism, for example, that is up and running in 19th century antebellum South is identical to the racism that's up and running, for example, when you get the Southern strategy that the Republican Party is using from 1963 forward. So I endorse Bell's idea about the permanence thesis of racism, but it's not the claim that there hasn't been any progress. Again, he'll repeatedly say that there has been progress, but he also wants to note that every time you see reform, you'll see a different kind of retrenchment.
Thank you. The next question for Dr. Swain. In your presentation, you clearly conveyed that you regard critical race theory as deleterious to better race relations in the United States today. Apart from critical race theory, what to you is the most important problem affecting race relations? And do you have any proposed solutions to that problem that is independent of critical race theory?
Well, I can tell you that I think that academia itself has had a detrimental impact on our society because the ideas they educate students, those people take jobs, and then they go out and they spread this. And I think that when you look at everyday people, the ones we work with, the ones we go to church with, the ones we live around, that these people get along, just great. And I think that with race relations, that we were headed in the right direction, I think in the early 2000s. And we saw a turn, in the mid to late 2000s where we started moving backwards. And there are a couple of things I want to say. One is that I'm concerned about CRT as it manifests itself in our society and the destructive impact it's having on Black and minority children, as well as white children. And I think it is setting us back.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers, two very short questions for you, so short that combining them. First, do you agree with Dr. Swain that critical race theory taken as a whole is having a deleterious effect on race relations in the United States? And second question, in your judgment, are white Christians today more likely to pay attention to institutions and social structures that disadvantage Blacks than they were, say, 30 years ago?
So I want to say that I think it is very difficult to say what effect critical race theory is having because, as everyone has, Dr. Yancey has argued, Dr. Cartagena has argued, the critics of critical race theory are attributing the title to a number of developments which actually are not critical race theory in and of themselves. So I think the most important thing that I would like to see coming out of critical race theory apart from the second question, which is the recognition of the reality of structural racism, is the focus at the K-12 level, because I know a lot of this is happening at the K-12 level, of really teaching US history as it happened. And I think that that is still an issue. In the South, slavery, the Civil War is still taught as being an issue of states' rights, as opposed to being really about slavery, about the abolition of slavery. And therefore, but if one goes back and looks at the history, if you look at the history that led up to the Civil War, it is clear about whether you were going to have free states or whether you were going to have slave states as the US expanded into the Western territories. It was about slavery. But that is still taught, not taught in Southern schools. So it seems to me dealing with the reality, and the reality that in fact, there was US law that subsequent to slavery, you don't have to go all the way back to the 19th century, that subsequent to slavery, US law systematically disadvantaged Black people. I think we need to be teaching our young people that. Not in a way that crushes them, not in a way that sends them home crying, but they need to know the truth about US history. Germany has taught the truth about what happened under Nazism and has been able to, in fact, deal with it. And they're stronger I don't want to suggest that it isn't resurgent. There are some resurgence of Nazism there, but the society is in a stronger position to resist that because people know the history. Here in the United States, too many people don't know the history. And the second question was, do I think white churches are more likely to recognize the structural nature of racism?
White Christians.
I'm not sure about that. I don't have data on it. Certainly, the Divided by Race is a fairly recent book written by two white Christian researchers, and they maintained that white Christians that they interviewed were not aware of the nature of structural racism. They weren't even, and in fact, sociologists still maintain that in general, Americans attribute life outcomes to individual effort rather than to structure. So apart from racialized structure, that's just true in general of Americans. So I hope that there's been progress made. I don't really have data on it, but I recognize it's still an issue.
Thank you. Professor Yancey, a question for you. And I think it's for you because of your work as a sociologist. Do you have any knowledge of whether some white Americans might be afraid or reluctant to engage critical race theory because of fear? That is, the fear of confronting the history of race relations in the United States. Are some white Americans unwilling to engage it because they would find it too troubling to acknowledge the history of race relations in this country?
Yeah, I mean, when you ask, are there some whites who might have that? I mean, you're a country of 300 million people. There's going to be some. The question is that substantial? That's an interesting question because really, up until yesterday, I had not heard of any whites who complained about the teaching of the history per se. Now, yesterday, I talked with I won't say what she does, but she was in a position to say, yeah, I had whites come and say, we don't want you teaching like the negative things about Columbus on Columbus Day, things of that nature. So my sense is that that's probably not the major fear out there, but I don't know if anyone's really studied those fears extensively to date, and so it's hard for me to say that's not a major fear. I can only go on what I've been hearing. Of course, that's limited by my own social circle and networks, and maybe I run into more educated networks, and that's the fear that's more at the lower classes. So I can't say that's not out there. I just have not run into it that much for myself.
Okay, thank you. So still more questions. I'll go back in the same order, but one comment for the audience. Some of you have sent in questions requesting transcripts of the presentations or asking the panelists to go over matters that they covered in their presentations. I did want you to know that this event is being recorded and the video will be uploaded to the King's College YouTube channel. So if you participate in this event, you will be receiving a notice when the video has been uploaded. So that will give you the opportunity to review those presentations if you miss something or if you want clarity. Notwithstanding that point, I am willing to go back and ask some questions based on statements made by our panelists. So this question for you, Dr. Cartagena. Several people wondered why you referred in your conclusion to these historical episodes as philosophical water. And one person asked, can you give an example, a historical example of philosophical water being transformed into wine? Because you seem to think that critical race theory for Christians could essentially take this philosophical water and transform it into wine. But can you give a historical example? And why specifically all those examples you cited at the end of your presentation, why did you characterize those as philosophical water?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a trained medievalist in addition to a race scholar. And so I'm thinking with my medieval sisters and brothers who, as in particular Boethius, will reflect on Jesus and John 2, turning water into wine. They'll argue that because all truth is God's truth, anything that is true, even if it's outside of Scripture, is that which you should endorse as a Christian. You should see it as nourishment, that which will help you on your pilgrimage to God and will help you to love God and neighbor better. And they're going to contend that as you take those truths and distinctively and intentionally work them into a Trinitarian vision, they will become what they'll call theological water. So two of the most famous proponents of this view are Boethius and Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas is the person that I wrote my dissertation on. So that's in the background. So all of those claims that that one paragraph where I go on a bit of a roll where I say this is philosophical water, this is philosophical water, this is philosophical water. What I'm getting at is all those claims, whether they're from Bell, Crenshaw, Matsuda, Ian Haney Lopez, Robert A. Williams, they're all truths. They're all truths that are found in CRT scholarship. They're all truths that CRT scholars work to defend and to present to people. So what I'm arguing is, okay, given that these things are true, if we think that all truth is God's truth, and we see this as extra biblical, how do we work those truths, which I'm going to argue are kind of philosophical water, into a distinctively Trinitarian vision of discipleship? So for myself, for example, it's very important to understand how the United States Supreme Court shaped both of my families and led to the ways in which in Puerto Rico, my families have been encouraged to assimilate into Anglo-Saxon white visions of whiteness, and how my mom's side of the family, Anglos from the US South, in particular South Carolina, had the same justices that rule in what are known as the insular cases that determined that the United States was going to keep Puerto Rico as a non-white colony, and they were going to maintain Puerto Ricans as foreign but domestic, and at the same time. So those same justices rule in Plessy v. Ferguson, and that decision gets up a black-white racial apartheid that shapes my mom's families in the U.S. South. So part of what I see is Christian discipleship requires that we ask, what are the social historical locations that we're in? What are the modes of oppression, exploitation, abuse, et cetera, that we experience? And how then do we walk with the Spirit to resist and remediate those forms? In the exact way that Hermana Rivers was talking about, as she quoted Matthew 25, as she quoted from the Proverbs, if we're going to care for people, we have to understand what the truths are about the world that we inhabit so that we can, my last point, avoid being locked in what Plato would call a cave, where we don't understand all of the social networks and realities that are shaping us. So part of, again, what it is to grow in godliness is to recognize those things and to work to resist and remediate those things that keep us from loving God and neighbor and keep us from understanding what our societies are really like.
Thank you. Professor Swain, a question that is in some sense autobiographical. One member of the audience would like to know, how did you reach your conclusions about critical race theory? Was this purely academic inquiry? Did it follow from some of your earlier scholarship? Did it have to do with your engagement with other citizens in the United States?
Okay.
The background on that, please.
Well, first of all, I want to say that the critical race theory that I understand and the people that I interact with I don't deny that racism exists, but I would argue that it's not something that only white people can be guilty of. I think that any group can be guilty of perpetrating racism against another group. And then as far as where do my views come from, I'm 67 years old, and my views come, from just growing older and hopefully wiser. I spent most of my life in the Democratic Party. In fact, I did not become a Republican until 2009, but I left the Democratic Party in 2000. And that was after I became a converted, born-again Christian. I became an independent for a while, and then eventually I embraced the Republican Party because it was the party that was closest to me. And during the time I was at Princeton teaching, and when I was in graduate school, I was not interested in Marxism or critical theory. I was a congressional scholar. That's what I wanted to be. And after the election of President Obama, that was when I started becoming interested in Marxism and critical race theory. And during my final years teaching at Vanderbilt, I left in 2017. I took early retirement. I was teaching a course on the impact of Marxism on political culture. And so I recognized critical race theory and what was happening back then. And I became involved in the current dialogue after George Floyd's death. And when it sort of exploded on the scene, I had so many people contacting me, asking me, for advice and, what should we do? And for me, I believe in principles, Judeo-Christian principles. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the Declaration of Independence. And I think that if you apply those principles to a race, to the racial situation in America, that you end up with, there's one race, the human race, that racism is always sin, that discrimination should never occur. And then we have laws that ban discrimination on the basis of race. And those laws that were passed to protect people like me, racial and ethnic minorities, who at that time in the 60s, we wanted equal opportunity, not equal outcomes, that those laws protect white people too. They protect men as well as women, because now, with critical feminist theory, males are the oppressors. They are guilty, supposedly, of toxic masculinity. And so I believe if we go back to values and principles, I think we can address these issues. And I don't think, we have to be at each other's throats. And so I believe that we can get past this racial divide, but it goes back to principles. And so for my views, it's the accumulated wisdom of a Black woman who was born in rural poverty, dropped out of high school, was a teen wife and mother, got a high school equivalency, went to a community college and earned 5 college and university degrees. I've won the highest prize in my profession. I've been cited by the US Supreme Court. And I think I'm a born again, spirit-filled Christian. I think I know a thing or two. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers, there was a question because you were talking about the issue of housing in the United States. Is it conceivable or perhaps likely that the spread of critical race theory might lead some whites or might make it less likely for certain whites to move into neighborhoods with significant Black communities or Black neighbors, precisely because of the sense that some whites feel that critical race theory characterizes them all as oppressors? That's the question the audience member puts forward. Is it conceivable that critical race theory might have this effect, that some whites might possibly be less willing to interact with and live among Blacks for fear of being characterized as the oppressor?
Well, it's impossible for me to say that no one would respond that way, but it is certainly my prayer that Christian whites would think deeply about the impact that decisions around residential choice are having. And the fact that there is this isolation, not only isolation on the racial level, it continues, racial segregation continues to be very high. especially in the Northeast and in the Midwest. It has decreased somewhat in the South, because of the expansion of populations and cities there, and also in the Southwest. However, that Christians would be thinking deeply about the impact of these residential decisions in terms of the quality of education that's available to people, to Black people, in terms of the impact of concentrated poverty on Black people, and that would shape their decisions far more than whether or not critical race theory suggests that they're oppressors. I also don't think that critical race theory is saying that all white people are oppressors. I have to agree with Dr. Yancey, I'm no expert on critical race theory, but my understanding of these tenets is talking about structure. It's talking about the impact that, yes, that has on individual thought, but it's much less focused on the individual. It's really focused on how do the laws operate? How do school systems operate? How does the job market operate? How does the marriage market operate? How do these systems that are in place in our society operate? Not about making individuals feel guilty, but rather about mobilizing us to change the way the systems operate, and so that they're less detrimental to the poor. Because I was saying that segregation is not only in terms of race, but also increasing segregation along class lines, that we would be thinking about that and strategizing about how to change our laws and our systems. I hope that would not discourage anyone from moving into mixed neighborhoods.
Thank you. Professor Yancey, a question for you. Given that people can write as proponents or friends of critical race theory, is it possible that some people who present themselves in this way are going so far afield that they're actually making critical race theory an easier target for people who are—
You mean like proponents of critical race theory, that the way that they are representing it makes it an easy target for them?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, look, there are people who, I mean, first, any ideas, there's going to be some extremists who take things way too far. I do think that sometimes the way the proponents of critical race theory characterize the opponents is sometimes unfair. And of course, when people hear that, they go, well, I don't want none of that. And, and part of the reason why I think we need more conversations is the way we talk to each other right now creates more polarization. And you only have to go to social media to find examples of this, and you wouldn't talk to your friend the way you talk to people on social media. Yeah, we do that all the time because we're enlightening one another. No, we're not. And so, yeah, I mean, I can find examples both ways. So I'm not trying to pick on the supporters of critical race theorists. But you're going to ask me, are there some who the way that they address it is very off-putting and reinforces some of the stereotypes? Absolutely. And it wouldn't take that much of an effort to find examples.
Thank you. If I could, as moderator, ask a broad question that's been on my mind for a while, especially this week, preparing for today's event. Would each of the panelists be willing to say something about the current controversy in the United States now pertaining to the possibility that critical race theory might be taught in public schools, right? Because some proponents of critical race theory think that this would be a good thing, and other people think that this would be a bad thing. One reason I believe that some people think it would be a bad thing is that young people are just not intellectually equipped to engage with all the complexities of history at this level. But we have a debate right now about whether it would be appropriate to have critical race theory included in public school curricula. So I'd like to ask each panelist for his or her comments on that, beginning with you, Dr. Cartagena.
So I'm going to echo one of the founders of CRT, who's a white brother named Gary Peller. And his claim is just about nobody, even at the level of being a senior in high school, is likely to be ready to engage what is in fact basic CRT literature because of the ways in which they're drawing from sociology, theology, history, legal studies, etc. So almost nobody's sitting down and teaching a Harvard Law Review article, a UCLA Law Review article, La Raza Law Review article. That's just not happening. So in terms of CRT proper, very few people are accessing CRT proper, again, because of where it is and because of how advanced it is. So I like Gary Peller, it's not something you're going to see, as he notes, people teaching. That said, I do want to echo something again that Hermana Rivers stressed, and that is my mama is somebody I loved tremendously. She's deceased now. That's why I use the past tense. She was born and raised in South Carolina. She was born and raised in the Jim and Jane Crow South. She was born and raised to endorse the lost cause myth. She was born and raised to believe that white supremacy played no role in the shaping of the United States, even though Thomas Jefferson, when writing to a British minister, said, like you all, we are making a white nation. So she was told things like, oh, no, slavery wasn't important, despite the fact that Alexander Stephens in the Cornerstone speech says, yes, the Confederacy is based on a vision of white supremacy and the importance of Black people being slaves to white people. So, I mean, I say this because for me, it was very important as I was talking with Mama, trying to understand why she believed what she believed. How did she get the particular, what Justo Gonzalez, a Cuban-American theologian, will call myths of innocence, into her, and why was she acting on those? It was important for me to try to provide more accurate histories. But again, to Hermana Rivers' point, such accurate histories are usually what's getting the most pushback. So there's no desire to say that Theodore Roosevelt was concerned that if you brought in Puerto Rico, you would commit racial genocide and you would undo the whiteness of the United States. You would make it impotent. He's very open about this. I know about this, and I see how it impacts my family. So I want to teach those accurate histories. Whether or not I'm ever going to call for somebody to teach the high-level reflections that Derek Bell's giving on Brown v. Board and interest convergence, I mean, that's probably not something to be teaching even seniors in high school, because they're not ready for it. But do I want them to have a more accurate understanding of, for example, the lost cause myth and why it's false, and why Du Bois went to great lengths in 1935 to show it was false? Yes. Is that going to be seen as critical race theory, even though it's not? Yes. Is it going to be labeled as racist and terrible? Yes. But was that exactly the kind of history that was going to prove medicinal for Mama so that she could work out some of the modes of white supremacy that she'd imbibed? Absolutely.
Thank you. Professor Swain.
Well, I can tell you, as someone who is involved with the ground game, that critical theory is being taught K through 12 all across America and in the South. And the problem is that some of the books that the children, I mean, they have them at different grade levels, have been exposed to, it cherry picks history. And I am a proponent of teaching history, and I've taught courses on the civil rights movement. And I think that when you talk about slavery, if you want to tell the true story of 1619, you have to say that the first Africans who came here to America were indentured servants. They served along beside white indentured servants. They were freed after 7 years. They became the backbone of the free Blacks in America. Many of them, or some number of them, became slaveholders themselves. You had Native American, Black, as well as white slaveholders. You had a period when, if Blacks converted to Christianity, they were set free. Tell the true story of the white abolitionists that always exist. Tell the true story of the Underground Railroad and the white philanthropy, and why whites and the story of whites and Blacks and other groups working together for racial justice. The civil rights movement was not a Black movement. It was a movement of Americans. Tell the true story. And if you tell the true story, it's positive. But CRT should not be taught, certainly to kids that are K through, high school is one thing, advanced level courses. But when you're talking about kids that are in grade school, kindergarten, that should not be taught. And I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue tied because I'm so passionate about these issues. When you think about these ideas about babies are racist by 6 months, and Sesame Street, Nickelodeon, everyone's in on the act with critical theory. It's very dangerous, and it's teaching our kids to see race, judge people by their race rather than the content of their character. Go back to Dr. Martin Luther King's vision, and I think we'd be better off as a society, because what we're doing now is destructive.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers, your thoughts on this?
So I agree. I think the idea of trying to teach critical race theory in the K through 12 curriculum is absurd. And I don't think anyone is promoting that. But this idea of really teaching the accurate history, because in fact, the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas in 1669, written by Locke himself, subverted what used to be the case that you could not enslave a fellow Christian. And in fact, it was made explicit that slaves could not claim freedom on the basis of their Christian belief. And it is true that slaves, enslaved Africans were treated much the same way as indentured whites. But according to Ira Berlin, that ends by the end of the 17th century. At the most, the middle of the 18th century, depending on which region of the country you're talking about. And in addition to that, from the very outset, enslaved Africans had to work to win that freedom, whereas if indentured whites survived their 7 years of indentureship, which many of them did not, the majority of them did not, but they were guaranteed freedom at the end of that 7 years. That was not the case for enslaved Africans. We need to teach accurate history to our children, and we need to help them recognize the reality of the impact of the structures in which we live, of the advantages that come with our families. That is all that I think we need to take from critical race theory into K-12 education. And we need to do it in a way which is gentle, loving, supportive, and does not impose a burden of guilt, but rather empowers our children to structure a more just society, a more Christian society.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. Professor Yancey.
Yeah, so I'm in agreement that it's not being taught. I mean, and if, I have 3 young kids, and if I found a professor, a teacher was trying to teach Crenshaw to them in the 11th grade, I'd be there saying, no, they're not ready for this, don't do that. But that's not what's being done. I would also agree that I want our history as accurate as possible. And that does not mean that it has to be all negative. It does not mean it has to be all positive, but we need the good and the bad. When I was in junior high, I learned about the Manifest Destiny as a great thing because it spanned the whole country. What I did not learn was how it affected had on the indigenous population. I should have learned both. Talk about how it helped create America, but also talk about what happened in the indigenous population. I don't see a problem with doing that. That's not critical race theory. To me, that's just accuracy. The 1619 projects brought up, historians have said that there's some serious problems with that. I accept that there's some serious problems with the 1619 project. Perhaps we should be very careful about, but that doesn't mean that we also don't talk about some of the other negative aspects that are happening in our history as well. So to me, it's about accuracy, not about critical race theory as far as history and being taught in that sense. As I said earlier on, I don't really deal with critical race theory. I had to lately because it became a controversy in my undergraduate class, but I don't deal with it until my higher level graduate course when I teach that class, my racial theories course. Because, that's when I feel like maybe students can now grapple with these ideas. And I'm not saying all professors are this way, but this is not being brought down into the K through 12. Now, here's what I will say. Are there problems with the way diversity and issues like that are dealt with K through 12? I would say absolutely. I'm not a fan of, for example, white fragility theory. And that's not critical race theory, but why not? So if that's being done, why not protest that? Say, I don't want D'Angelo taught because here's some problems I have with D'Angelo. Instead of saying, I don't want critical race theory taught. To me, that'd be a more accurate way of addressing the issues and allow us to deal with the issues rather than throwing everything under the rubric of critical race theory. And that's the problem I have with a lot of protests we have today. Not that they don't ever have a legitimate point, but that it gets lost into saying this is critical race theory when it is not.
Thank you for that. So Dr. Rivers, you had a quick comment.
Yes, I just wanted to add that the laws that are being passed against critical race theory I think may be problematic. So for example, Texas has passed a law that requires that children cannot be taught that slavery was anything but an aberration. And I think that that is problematic. And I think that these laws, I don't know the details of these laws, but I think that there is real potential difficulty there. I think that the pushback against this assumption that critical race theory is being taught can in fact take us backwards from the goal of actually teaching accurate American history.
Professor Swain, is your hand up?
Yes, I'm familiar with the laws that have been passed, and most of them don't that are aimed at getting at what critical race theory does. It doesn't mention critical race theory. It describes behaviors that teachers or administrators or people may engage in that violate students' rights. And so this is the first time I've ever heard that Texas passed a law that said that teaching slavery was an aberration. I don't know of any state that passed a law that said that. And, you know, if you have evidence of that, I'd like to see it.
Professor Yancey, and I'll give you the last word because we're just about out of time.
Okay, so this is the Texas law is a great example. Okay, so I live in Texas, so I get this. All right, so because we don't define critical race theory well enough, you get you know, what's a teacher to do? Because how do they know they're violent? Because they're not teaching critical race theory proper. I think almost everyone agrees with that, right? So we know that in a school district nearby where I'm from, I forget the exact, whether South Lake or something like that, there was an administrator who was saying, well, on the Holocaust, teach both sides. Now, I listened to that tape, and what's happening is the administrator is saying, let's be extra cautious because there's this law here saying that we can't teach critical race theory. Now, what they're saying is nonsensical, right? Because everyone knows the Holocaust happened. I mean, there's arguments as to the origin of it, but there's no debate. So what's both sides of the Holocaust? But it's the reaction to this way to regulate critical race theory, which is not well defined, that creates this sort of comments. And that's why we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful. I realize that K through 12, you can't, there's some regulation on what people teach, and I get that. But we got to be very specific on what we're talking about. And since critical race theory is not proper, is not being taught in K through 12, these laws are really, I think, unnecessary.
Thank you. Thank you. We are just about out of time, but I would, as a moderator, like to applaud all four of the panelists. This was terrific. And I'm saying this not pro forma, but it's genuinely my enthusiasm to watch this panel discussion again after it's uploaded to the King's College YouTube channel. I am sure I will learn more when I can watch the entire video again in leisurely fashion. I've absorbed a lot from all four of you and benefited greatly, and I'm sure I'm speaking for the audience as well in saying that. So thank you again. Thank you to the audience for your interest, giving a part of your Saturday to attend this event. Again, it's my understanding all people who registered for this event will receive a notice from the King's College when the video has been uploaded to the YouTube channel. So we look forward to further engagement with these topics. With that, I wish everybody a good day and enjoy the rest of the weekend. And thank you.